What's up, everybody? Matt Kajeski here, back again with the Stokastic DFS channel, talking some college football. It's the Week 9 main slate. Crazy, it's Week 9 already, but I'm pumped for these games and pumped for the rest of the season. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by Prize Picks, and if you've never heard of Prize Picks, they are daily prop-based offerings. You're making lineups of player props. It's all your normal statistical categories. For football, you've got passing yards, rushing yards, receptions, touchdowns, everything. And it's not just that. You can do this across sports if you're an NBA fan, an MLB fan, a hockey fan, whatever it is. And you can mix and match them in your entries. And better yet, they have a phenomenal offer for you guys today when you hit the link in the video description below. All you have to do is make your first deposit, and you're going to get a match deposit bonus up to $100 and 1 free month of Stokastic Plus Platinum. So click the link in the video description below to take advantage of that. Without further ado, let's dive into the slate. This is our player data usage tool behind the scenes. You're going to see up at the top all of our game environment factors: pace, pass rate. O-line is just sacks allowed, D-line sacks generated, our Vegas data, and then yardage allowed, passing, then per attempt, rushing, and then rushing yard per attempt. Those per attempts trying to contextualize a little bit. And it's a 13-game slate, so we're going to get right into this with our first matchup. It's Oklahoma State taking on Kansas State. This is a game that has a 56 total, a 1-point spread in favor of Kansas State. Differing offenses, like drastically different. At the top here, we've got Oklahoma State 6th in pace, Kansas State 98th. Pass rate 51% for Oklahoma State, 39% for Kansas State. Injury is going to be a big part of this game. Let's start with the Oklahoma State side, where we've got Spencer Sanders. He's been nursing an injury to his throwing shoulder, but he's still played awesome. 290 yards per game through the air, 352 on the ground. That's on 37 and a half attempts per game through the air. That's just awesome volume for Spencer Sanders, and he's putting it all together. He's looked awesome this year. He's also stackable. The one thing I'll say is you got to worry about some injuries here. Last week, they did not have Braden Johnson, their previous number one receiver, and they did not have Jaden Bray, who returned for one game only to re-aggravate his injury. I don't think we see him soon, but we could see Braden Johnson back at any point. Again, he was the wide receiver one when healthy. He's averaging 6.5 targets per game, 66 yards per game. Both those lead the team. The overall receiving leader right now is Brennan Presley, 59 yards per game for him, 5.9 targets. He had 9 targets last week, which was awesome. The one thing I'll say is you're still seeing Bryson Green run more routes than him. And yes, Brennan Presley has out-targeted him 47-38, but Green popped up for 10 targets last week. He now leads the team with 417 yards. I'm not entirely sure Brennan Presley's ahead of Bryson Green. So if you're saving a little bit of money here, I think Green is fine. The other players rounding out this room are John Paul Richardson, who's averaging 6.3 targets per game himself, just not really that efficient. 44, 45 yards per game for John Paul Richardson. He's on the field a lot, so he's fine. And then the replacement for Braden Johnson was Stephon Johnson, freshman for them, 10 targets. Pretty efficient player here, too. Again, he only has 13 targets in the last 3 games, but 10 targets in their most recent game. I don't think he plays a ton if Braden Johnson returns, but if Stephon Johnson is the starter like he was last week, the stone minimum for him is a phenomenal price. So you're just going to have to watch. This team's running forward wide most of the time. In the backfield, Dominic Richardson got hurt, which is something to watch because he's been their bell cow this year. This team doesn't have a great run blocking unit, so it's largely been inefficient. He's averaging 20.6 touches per game, but most of that has come via receiving, like the production that is. 30.5 receiving yards per game to 65 rushing yards. We'll watch Dominic Richardson. I think Jaden Nixon gets the first crack at the backfield if Richardson misses, but Ollie Gordon could function here too a little bit as a change of pace. A tough situation to target, but you're not going to hear any injury updates. You're just going to have to watch a pregame to see if Richardson plays. Kansas State. Adrian Martinez is allegedly dealing with a bone bruise. Suffered the injury 2 weeks ago. And then he played initially last week, but then he checked himself out, remained on the sideline, dressed. So we have no idea if he plays. You're just going to have to watch pregame. The bone bruise has me worried because he is a dual threat, but more of your game manager type. He only averages 129.5 passing yards per game on 20 attempts, but 565 rushing yards is elite. Now, if he's limited in any way by that bone bruise, does that affect his efficiency? These are all big questions for me. Now, Oklahoma State has been incredibly giving, especially via the pass on defense this year, but there's enough risk if Martinez plays where I think I'm going to leave him to large field tournament builds. And if he doesn't play, Will Howard executed the offense well. He's mobile, 31 rush yards last week. Pretty solid as a passer, too. I think he could be useful as a high floor, low ceiling type option if you need the salary. In the backfield, you could also just see Deuce Vaughn handle extra work here, which is honestly what they probably should do. Deuce Vaughn has not been quite as involved this year as he was last year. He's only averaging 3.3 targets per game, which is a bit of a shock. But I think when the going gets tough, he's still the guy they lean on. You're still seeing 22 touches per game, 107 rushing yards per game, 15 receiving yards per game. And he's not 9K. His prices come down a little bit. He's playable here. In the receiving room, these guys are always volatile just because it's a low volume passing attack. If I were to rank them, Phillip Brooks would be the 1. You'd have Malik Knowles as the 2, and then Cade Warner as the 3. Very close between them. I think there's a clear tier break once you drop from Brooks and Knowles to Warner, but that's reflected in price. Just GPP plays. Ohio State, Penn State. This game is a 15.5 spread in favor of Ohio State, traveling into Penn State. 61 total here. Ohio State's really slow, 111th at pace, 45% pass rate, but it doesn't matter. They're just so efficient here. What I'll say about Stroud is he's expensive for good reason, but he doesn't run. He has -9 rushing yards. Generally, he's not taking a lot of sacks, but he doesn't run at all. So he is, like, if you're playing him in tournaments, you need 450 yards and 4 scores to pay this off. There's just too many good dual threats who have similar volume to him and, like, not quite the efficiency, but enough efficiency to pay off their price tag versus Stroud. You needed a blow up spot from him to pay off in tournaments. And then he's hard to stack. Like, he's expensive, and so are his pass catchers. The only guy who's cheap is tight end Cade Stover, who I think is fine in stacks. 3.6 targets per game. He's going to have games where he's got multi-touchdowns. That's fine for stacks. But then Emeka Ibuka, 6,900. You have Marvin Harrison, 7,400. If Smith and Jigba plays more, he's 6,500. Julian Fleming, 51. So the stacks are expensive. If I'm playing any of these guys, it's number 1, Ibuka, 105 yards per game, 8.3 targets. Harrison has essentially the same volume, 85.4 yards per game on 8.3 targets as well. Harrison's slightly more expensive, so I prefer Ibuka in a vacuum, but both are fine. And then the next, I guess, group of players depends on the status of Smith and Jigba, who was checked out of last week's game. If you're playing Smith and Jigba, it's just a bet on health, which I don't think you can make the bet right now. He just hasn't played at all this year, even remotely close to a full-time role, and I think he's probably limited regardless. And then when it's not Smith and Jigba, it's Fleming, whose role is depressed by at least the presence of Smith and Jigba. I think Fleming's still fine in tournaments at 4.2K, but these guys are risky, and all of them are expensive. With that said, Ohio State always deserves considerations, and you want pieces. In the run game, this is true as well. Trevion Henderson and Mayan Williams, strict 50-50 timeshare. Efficiency's been awesome for both of them. I mean, 79 yards per game for Henderson, 86 per game for Mayan Williams. Both can catch the ball. These are pay up to be contrarian spots on an explosive offense. Penn State's implied team total is just shy of 23 points. Sean Clifford's coming off his best game of the year, and he only passed for 295 there. He's averaging 206.4, some of that due to injury, in-game injury, but he's been a game manager, like a fancy game manager. 141 rushing yards. Most of that came on 1 carry against Michigan. A lot of risk with him against Jim Knowles' defense here. He's just too expensive outside of the largest tournaments for me. They also use a timeshare between Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Singleton's running laps around him efficiency-wise. It's not even close, but they're still using the timeshare. Perhaps it's just because Singleton, the freshman, not comfortable with the whole offense yet. They've also ebbed and flowed drastically depending on game script. 2 games ago, they both had 6 carries. 3 games ago, they both had 21. So if they're down in this game, expect low volume. I don't have a ton of interest in the backfield. The receivers, you could maybe use a one-off here. Keandre Lambert-Smith did not play in their last game after people thought he would. So Harrison Wallace started in his place. Wallace would be intriguing as a stone min play if Lambert-Smith misses, but ultimately I do think he returns. With that said, I would rather just pay up for Mitchell Tinsley or Parker Washington. Washington averages more yards per game on fewer targets. He's also cheaper, so he'd be the guy I look to, but they're pretty expensive just for one-offs or runbacks. Game 3, TCU, West Virginia. This one is a banger. 69 total, 7.5 point spread in favor of TCU, 7 in some spots. TCU's 83rd in pace, 46% pass rate. They'll play fast in spots, and this could be one of the spots against West Virginia. Max Duggan is awesome. He's averaging 267 passing yards per game on just 27.5 attempts, and then he has 274 rushing yards. This guy easily can eclipse 300 yards in any given spot, and West Virginia has a bottom 4 defense in all of college football. That is not a joke. 131 FBS teams, West Virginia, they're in the bottom 4 pass defenses, 9.1 yards per attempt. Duggan, even with the rising price tag, is playable. He's not the stone lock he was previously, but he's still a good play. He's also easy to stack. You've got Alpha Quentin Johnston, 82 yards per game, 8.6 targets. That number has risen to 11 targets per game in the last 4. I think he's fine. Savion Williams is still running the second most routes, just not being targeted at all. He is wind sprinting his way out of my lineups, really. I've been playing him a lot, and he just is not seeing any targets. 2.4 per game. They're using rotational players, Darius Davis and Tay Barber, more than him. But the one change I really want to focus on with TCU is they started to use their tight end more. We're seeing Jared Wiley play a good amount of snaps and routes. 56% of the routes last week. That came directly at the expense of Tay Barber. Darius Davis still on the field a fair amount. But I think if I'm punting on a guy, maybe it's Jared Wiley now. I don't know. It's tough because Savion Williams still had a 71% route share. That was clearly the second most. He could be usable as a punt too, but it's basically Johnson or bust at this point for receivers. Kendre Miller, they clearly showed they're willing to use him when they need to. 29 carries last week. One target, 30 touches for Kendre Miller. We have never seen that upside for him. He now has 25 and 30 touches in back-to-back weeks. If this game's even remotely close, Kendre Miller's a smash at this price. They will use Amari Demercado as a change of pace. They've done that all year. So don't be too worried about, the 8 carries for Demercado last week, 9 the week before. Kendry's their guy. And matchup may not be as good as the past game, but he's certainly viable. West Virginia, 44th in pace, 53.5% pass rate. JT Daniels has been a big disappointment for this team. He's non-efficient. He's non-mobile, negative 43 yards on the ground, meaning he has to make up through the air. And he's averaging 36 attempts per game. That's awesome. But 241 passing yards speaks to his 6.6 yards per attempt. It's been a real struggle for JT Daniels. He's not playable because of the negative rushing yards outside of just massive tournaments. And I'm just going to X him out. In the backfield, Tony Mathis is down for this team. That should give CJ Donaldson a chance at a full workload here. And TCU's good on defense, but they've shown cracks. And if Donaldson's going to receive a monstrous workload, I think he's viable. He's been hyper efficient, 70 rushing yards per game, another 4.5 as a receiver, which he's seeing an expanded role there. If you looked at the game before he suffered that nasty concussion and got stretchered off, he had 26 touches, and that was with Mathis and Johnson, both active. Tony Mathis. CJ Donaldson's been really efficient, and he could see a larger workload here. He's tournament viable for sure. In the past game, it's Bryce Ford-Wheaton and Caden Prather is the top 2. Over the last 4 games, you've got Wheaton at 8.8 targets per game, Prather at 9.3. Prather is seeing an increased role. Now, I think Wheaton's still the one here, but I'd rather save the money and play Prather between the two. Sam James is the third, kind of distantly, 6.8 targets per game over that same span. But he's playable if you need to. He's only 100 cheaper than Prather's the problem. So I think he's more of just like, all right, your contrarian pivot off Prather, but that's how I would rank them. Prather 1, BFW 2, James 3 in terms of just price-adjusted plays here. Outside of that, Reese Smith has been playing a little more because we lost Mike O'Laughlin. And then Brian Palendi, he's their tight end replacement for O'Laughlin, but it's just not the same caliber receiver. So you're seeing them play more forward wide, more Reese Smith. He could be probably just a tournament play. I don't really want to play a lot of Reese Smith at that price. There's just better options. All right. Notre Dame taking on Syracuse. Not the best game. 47.5 total. 2.5 point spread in favor of Cuse. Looking for a bounce back after the Clemson loss. Both teams slow. Both teams run heavy. Not too much to spend time on there. Notre Dame only a 22.5 implied total. The complete polar opposite from last week. Drew Pine's a game manager, somewhat mobile, 92 yards. Maybe that's 62. I think I flipped those, honestly, but I'll take a look on the back end. All this to say he's just limited mobility-wise. 179.5 passing yards per game is not great. If you're stacking, you're using Michael Mayer or Lorenzo Styles, and it's not really even a conversation. I'm going to play Mayer if I am playing a guy here. 10.8 targets per game over the last 4, 75 receiving yards. Mayer is like the stone alpha for this team, a 36% target share. I think you play Mayer and you move on if you play anyone at all. In the backfield, this is worth mentioning. Audric Estime has 3 fumbles, I believe, in the last 2 games, something like that. He fumbled last week, and he's clearly in the doghouse now. 3 carries, 28 carries went to Logan Diggs. And the one thing I want to say here is it's not just the run game. He ran more routes than Chris Tyree. Tyree, he still had 12 touches himself, but Logan Diggs running more routes, 28 carries. We'll see if Estime is still in the doghouse here. Like, they've been a 3-way committee all season long, but Diggs has also been efficient. I mean, we could see a changing of the guard. I think he's worthwhile in tournaments. I won't play him anywhere else just because this very easily could be a 3-way committee on a team with a mini implied team total. Syracuse, you've got Garrett Schrader operating the Robert Anae offense. Schrader, 5,900. He's mobile, 371 yards for him, 229.7. So basically 230 through the air on just 25.7 attempts. He's been really efficient. The problem is Notre Dame plays good defense. Schrader's more of your contrarian GPP price tag play. So not a ton of interest, but for tournaments, I think he's live. In the backfield, it's Sean Tucker or bust, really. Tucker, interestingly, has been really cannibalized by Garrett Schrader. This is kind of tough to see. I got to go back and check this, but this just scrapes data. 5 carries for him in their last game. You see that number and it feels like it can't be right, but Schrader's 16 design rush attempts. I'm going to cross-reference this in the back end because this just could be, a coding error, but Sean Tucker's still averaging 100 yards per game. If this is true, you got to think it regresses positively at some point. This is just flat out amazing to see. And yeah, 5 carries for Tucker. Wow. That is eye-opening. He's going to be a GPP play. I'm almost speechless. It's my first time seeing this. I haven't written up this game yet, but I think you're now clearly preferring Deuce Vaughn. Like, there's a lot of other backs. Kendry Miller. Like, if he's got this volatility in his game, he just has to be played behind some of these other elite backs. And we'll talk about them. I'll try to reference Tucker more throughout the show, but wow. Again, I think he's a bounce back, but that is alarmingly bad. In the past game, Arondé Gadsden's really the only guy I have a ton of interest in, and he's expensive. 6.4 targets per game, 84.7 yards. The tight end receiver hybrid has been awesome this year, and I think he's fine, but he's expensive, so it's him versus the other studs in the slate, really. The only other guy with a consistent route share has been Devon Cooper. He's actually participated in at least 60% of the routes in 5 straight games for this team. If I'm punting somebody, it's probably him, but he's honestly not even a punt. Maybe you could look to Trevor Pena, 5 targets in their last game, only a 42% route rate, so it's probably just one you want to avoid. Arkansas, Auburn, 62 total, 3.5 point spread in favor of the Razorbacks on the road. Both teams coming off the bye. Arkansas 18th in pace, Auburn 58th. Both these teams run heavy, more so on the Arkansas side. Arkansas, you've got KJ Jefferson playing elite football efficiency-wise, just doesn't have the volume. 244 passing yards per game on just 27 attempts is great. He's super involved in the run game. 344 yards on the ground there. Cumulatively, 6,300 is a great price tag for him. Auburn's allowing 5.1 yards per carry. We'll talk about that when we get to Raheem Sanders, but KJ Jefferson, 10 design rush attempts last week. He's super involved in the ground is what I'll say. He's certainly playable and semi-cash viable. From there, you've got Raheem Sanders in the backfield. Started ceding a little more work to Rashad Dubinian and AJ Green, but that was against BYU. They ended up winning that game pretty resoundingly. I think Raheem Sanders is still the guy they want to use when they need to put their chips down. 127 rushing yards per game. Capable pass catcher. He's averaging another 23.7 yards there. Raheem Sanders probably just trying to get his workload spelled a little bit because he's been hammered into the back of the offensive line 158 times already this year. He's solid play though. 6,900. I think I prefer Raheem Sanders to Sean Tucker right now. In the receiving game, it's basically locked in who's getting the ball. Jaden Hazelwood's their wide receiver 1 on the year. He's playing through a shoulder injury. I think it might be a labrum or something he said. Maybe it was a separation. All that to say, it's not something that's getting better like tomorrow. So he's a bit risky based on that. But he's still the target leader. A little too expensive for my liking. And then unfortunately, the guy I've been leveraging him with, Matt Landers, is expensive now too. He's consistently ran more routes than Hazelwood this year, and he's played really well lately. 9, 3, and 10 targets in the last 3. Trey Knox, third most involved receiver, 3,600. I think maybe you're playing him or Keytron Jackson as the pivots. Keytron's played ahead of Warren Thompson. That's really the only thing to note here, but it's a low volume passing attack with no real condensed target share, so tough to play any of them. Auburn, man, I don't know what this team is doing. 46% pass rate, 58th in pace. Allegedly, TJ Finley's healthy. They're just running out Ashford, so not really expecting that to change. Ashford's been bad as a passer. He's very mobile, though. 310 rush yards on the year. Arkansas's defense is atrocious, mainly because of injury. 8.6 yards per pass attempt. This pass coverage is non-existent. 4.7 yards on the ground, too. That's per carry. They're not great against the run either. So this comes down to, is Ashford efficient enough to take advantage of it? Ultimately, it's a great total. Auburn has a solid team total. I'm a little worried that Finley might get some snaps at some point. So Ashford just in tournaments for me, but he's cheap enough to play here. I mean, the matchup couldn't be better. In the backfield, still about a 60-40 split Tank Bigsby to Jarquez Hunter, maybe moving a little 70-30. Tank Bigsby's been awesome too. Efficiency for him is great. 17.4 touches per game. He just doesn't have the same touch upside as, your whoever it may be, your Deuce Vaughns, even like your Sean Tucker, I want to say, but Sean Tucker, I don't know if he has that upside. He certainly has the upside. I don't know if he has that consistency, but Mo Ibrahim, there's like a ton of guys that have more raw touches than Tank Bigsby. With that said, it's factored into price. Great matchup for Tank. I think he's more alive in tournaments than he's been in a while this week. Then in the receiving room, this is a complete mess. You want to talk routes specifically for Auburn. It's probably a situation I'm just avoiding altogether, but John Samuel Schenker and Coy Moore have been the most consistent route runners on this team for a while now. Target's not consistent, and Shedrick Jackson came back at a 70% route share last week. Javarius Johnson leads the team in yards. I'm just avoiding all of the Auburn pass catchers when possible, which certainly is here. If you force me to rank them, I would take shots on Schenker and Moore before I did anybody else. Oklahoma, Iowa State. 1.5 point spread in favor of the Sooners. 56 totals, pretty middling here. Oklahoma's playing really fast. 5th in the country in pace. That's that Jeff Lebby offense. 42% pass rate. Dylan Gabriel, I think he's a solid play. He's just expensive, similar to Stroud. He's more mobile than Stroud. 163 rushing yards in the year. Averaging 271 as a passer. He missed almost over a half of one of their games against TCU. So some of these numbers are depressed for Gabriel, but he still kind of needs a 300-yard bonus to get you the ceiling, which he's live to do in any game. Iowa State plays pretty good defense, so I think this keeps Gabriel a tournament play. As for stacks, Marvin Mims is going to be your wide receiver 1. 7,500 is a pretty penny, but 15 targets in the last game. He's averaging 8.8 targets per game over the last 4, 77 receiving yards per game. Love Mims. Braden Willis has also been really involved as their tight end. Second most targets on the year. Second most receiving yards for Willis. He's only 4K, and he's also involved in the run game. He has 8 carries over the last 2 games. I think he's worth a shot. Then Jaleel Farouk. He's the wide receiver 2 for the most part. The one thing I'll say here is they benched Theo Wees. Jaleel Farouk's not at 100% route rate anymore. They're using Drake Stoops a lot. Drake Stoops, his route rate jumped above 90% last week. This is just a flat-out benching situation, it looks like. I don't think this is a rotation. They seem to be very unhappy with what they've gotten from Theo Wees. 92% of their routes for Drake Stoops last week. Then you had Jaleel Farouk at 50%. They also ran a lot of 12 personnel. Daniel Parker played a lot. There's a very real chance Drake Stoops is the wide receiver 2 moving forward. As ridiculous as that sounds. 3,900, you got to consider Stoops. And I don't think I've ever said that before in my life. I'm looking at Mims, Willis, and Stoops here above all else. Iowa State, you've got Hunter Deckers, quietly making some strides. They're 77th in pace, but 58% pass rate. Deckers has played better. I was very critical of him to start the year. He looked great last week. Maybe not. He looked better last week. Now he's averaging 263 per game through the air on 37 and a half attempts, 34 rush yards. He's generally not taking zeros there, but he's also not really mobile. He's starting to enter the conversation for cheap tournament punt. I'm a little hesitant still because of that early season poor play he showed, but I mean, it's his first year starting. Maybe he's just growing into his role. All this to say, Deckers is slowly becoming somewhat GPP viable. The backfield is a disaster. It's a four-way timeshare between Jarrell Brock, Deion Silas, Eli Sanders, and Cartavius Norton. Silas led the group last week. No confidence in the way this moves going forward. The receiving room is very easy to decipher. You have Xavier Hutchinson, the pure alpha, 14.4 targets per game, 108 receiving yards per game. He hasn't seen any fewer than 13 targets in any of the last 4 games. He's not expensive enough if you want to play him. Jalen Noel's on the field every single play. He's averaging 6.9 targets per game himself, 54 yards per game, 4,600 is fine. Then Dimitri Stanley, 5 targets per game, 37 yards. You could do worse than playing a punt Dimitri Stanley, the Colorado transfer, at 3,200. He is kind of your not Stoneman, but close to Stoneman, open up the slate for your studs everywhere else type play. And this game environment's not terrible. I don't mind Dimitri Stanley and Drake Stoops. It's a pretty good cheap value play game. Georgia Tech, FSU taking tons of money. This spread has nearly moved 7 points. 47.5 total, 24-point spread. Georgia Tech implied for just shy of 12 points. Jeff Sims is questionable. If he doesn't play, this team is a disaster. Zach Gibson, he just is not capable of playing at this level. Non-mobile, pocket passer. Sims at least has elite mobility. Could be compromised even if he plays. Now he's dealing with lower body injuries. Probably not playing either. Hassan Hall is very interesting to me. He dominated snaps. And I think you saw Dante Smith come up for 9 carries when the game got out of hand. Hassan Hall has been the lead back otherwise. 5K is still a bit expensive for a guy on a 12-point implied team total, but he's at least worth mentioning. His receiving role's been sick too. 4 targets per game in the last 4 for Hassan Hall. In better matchups, I'm going to be slamming him. The receiving room, we saw the return of Malachi Carter. He immediately came back to being a top 2 receiver. It's McCollum and Malachi Carter, EJ Jenkins, the 3. I don't really want to play anybody else. This is a team to avoid. Florida State has a monstrous implied team total, nearly 36, 76th in pace, 51% pass rate. They should be run heavier here. Jordan Travis, he's one of these plays I want exposure to, but probably not in cash. 237 yards per game through the air on 28 attempts. He's also missed parts of games because of injury. 222 yards on the ground. We know how mobile he is. Just a sick upside with Jordan Travis. Trayshawn Ward, they've been pretty quiet on his status. It looked like he underwent surgery for something. I don't know. He took a picture and posted it on Instagram of him in a hospital bed. That raises the question to me, like how quick is he to return? But you haven't really heard, so don't be surprised if he plays. If he doesn't, it's basically Trey Benson and Lawrence Toafili handling the backfield. Toafili actually played a little more than Benson in their last game, and he's the preferred pass catcher. 7 targets for Toafili last week. He had 18 touches. At 3,900, Toafili is in play. I think his name is actually Toafili. Excuse me, Lawrence Toafili, if you're playing. I've always called him Toafili. So excuse me if you're a Florida State fan. I greatly apologize. This is just a habit I need to break. Toafili. All right, 18 touches for him in the last game. Trey Benson, he was at 9. So with the pass game roll to Toafili, I think 3,900 is not quite enough. You just don't think they're going to pass as much here, as massive favorites over Georgia Tech. Honestly, because of that, I think both Benson and Toafili are fantastic GPP plays because they're so cheap. We kind of saw this against Duquesne, and now not to compare Georgia Tech to Duquesne, but in games with massive spreads, multiple running backs are going to have productive days here. That's not a surprise. It wouldn't be a surprise. In the receiving room, Johnny Wilson, still that dude, complete stud, 70 yards per game, 7.1 targets. He's up at 8.3 targets per game over the last 4. We've seen Micah Pittman and Ontario Wilson recently start rotating a little bit more. This team was kind of banged up at receiver to begin the year. You had a couple guys out who are now back healthy, which I think kind of muddies the waters here. Like last week, Ontario Wilson, or last game, 39% route share. Micah Pittman was at 49. Malik McLean had a 39% route share. Deuce Spann at a 38% route share. Like tight end, Marqueston Douglas was at 24%. Cam McDonald saw his route share jump to 73%. Behind Johnny Wilson is going to be a little volatile, it looks like. So Wilson's the preferred guy I want to get to. I'll still play a little Micah Pittman in Ontario, but Cam McDonald viable as well down here in this range at 36 for a punt. Rutgers, Minnesota, 40.5 total. Not too much to talk about here. 14-point spread in favor of Minnesota. We don't have a clear starter at the quarterback position for Rutgers. It was Noah Vidral last week. Gavin Wimsatt, their 4-star freshman's been injured. He was allegedly the backup. They basically said this is going to rotate on a week-to-week basis. They gave Samuel Brown 28 carries. Holy smokes. It's been a timeshare most of the year, but he is working ahead of some of these other guys now. They're big underdogs, but if they're going to carry 28 times with Sam Brown, he's viable in tournaments. He's the stone min. Now, no confidence it doesn't become an Al-Shadi Salam game or a Kyle Monangai game, or even, like they use Johnny Lang and their tight end as a gadget player. Vidral is going to get a lot of designed attempts. Crookshank's going to get attempts. If Wimsatt plays, he's a dual threat. So it's volatile, but I mean, you can take shots on Brown at the stone min. In the receiving game, that former quarterback, Johnny Langan, leads the team in targets, 38. Not efficient whatsoever, but wow. That is a surprise to see. 7.8 targets per game in the last 4. Pretty good for Sir Johnny Langan. Aaron Crookshank is the guy I would play if I was stacking this game, but I don't plan on stacking it. 5.3 targets per game, 35.3 yards. The wide receiver 2, Sean Ryan. Shameen Jones, the 3. Not too interested. Minnesota, I think we get Tanner Morgan back. The team is extremely slow and run heavy, but Morgan, he basically needs to be coaxed via negative game script into pass heavy sets. Otherwise, he's not playable. 74 rushing yards is okay, but just 194 as a passer. Not going to work for him at that volume. And then in the running back room, we saw Mohamed Ibrahim finally handle that workload we saw in previous years. 29 carries for him. They'll use him now. I know this for a fact when the chips are down. 133 rushing yards per game for Ibrahim. He can also catch the ball. Hasn't done it a ton this year, but he is capable. He's someone to look at 7,300. I love him a lot more at this price compared to 9K where he was in previous weeks. So Ibrahim, like him more than I actually have at any point this season. I think he's a solid play against Rutgers here. Pass catchers, not too much interest in any of these guys just because they're on the lowest volume passing attack outside of the Air Force and Army and Navy. But Brevin Spanford leads the team, 6.3 targets per game over the last 4. He leads the team in receiving yards. He's also cheaper than Michael Stevens and Daniel Jackson. I'll just play Brevin Spanford if I'm playing any of them. They lost Chris Ottman-Bell for the year. Florida, Georgia, 22.5 point spread, 56.5 total. Georgia is giving up some points to opposing teams. Missouri played them close. Now, I don't really think Florida is capable here. I mean, we'll see. Anthony Richardson is an awesome skill set. Just, is this the game I want to target him with the 17 total? I don't think so. He's got great mobility, 391 yards, 195 passing yards per game, but tough matchup for him. Low total. Honestly, I'm probably not playing anyone on Florida. Richardson would be just the deepest in GPPs. It's a 3-way timeshare running back. Depending on the status of Naquan Wright, they benched him last week, so that kind of limited it to Montrell Johnson and Trevor Etienne. But you saw Lorenzo Lingard pop up for 3 carries. They seem insistent on using 3 backs. Justin Shorter leads the team in targets with 36, just narrowly ahead of Xavier Henderson. Yardage difference is pretty drastic between the two, 150 separate them. I'm just going to play Shorter if I play any receiver. Ricky Pearsall and Xavier Henderson should not be more expensive than him based on volume and output. Florida is pretty easy to evaluate here. Just a one-off here, there, or pass. Georgia, they're passing 51% of the time, but they're 117th in pace. Similar to Ohio State, it is an efficiency thing for them. Bennett's averaging 290 passing yards per game on 33 attempts, and it could be even better. He's left some plays on the field. He's also semi-mobile, 115 rush yards for Bennett. He never has played in DFS, and this offense is elite. I like using him occasionally. They have a 39.5 team total, which is massive. So I'll play some Bennett, use him as a pivot off Stroud and Gabriel. The backfield's really tough to evaluate. It's going to be a committee regardless of the status of Kendall Minton. If you're playing any of them, it's probably Kenny McIntosh because he's the best receiver on the team among backs. But Daewon Edwards is probably the best price-adjusted guy at 4,100. you're accessing a ceiling with him. Would have more interest if Milton misses, but 334 yards leads the team on the ground, and he's 4,100. Price to pay, kind of, but ultimately it's going to be a timeshare. You need multiple scores. Ladd McConkey saw his route rate drop pretty drastically last week. Now, I don't know if this continues moving forward, but 36% of the routes in their most recent game for Ladd McConkey, that's an issue. Brock Bowers was at 51%, so it could have just been a game script thing for them. They'll take guys out of games when they're in certain environments, so I'm not too worried. If I'm playing anyone, it's still Brock Bowers. Like, I'm just going to find the difference in salary to get up to Bowers. He leads the team in receiving yards. He's hyper efficient. They just spread their snaps out quite a bit here. Otherwise, I think you're probably looking at like a contrarian Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, 4.3 targets per game over the last 4. He's 3,100. I think that's fine. Otherwise, like, routes are not consistent for these pass catchers, and they rotate a lot of guys. Jacksaint at least is above 50% of the routes in the last 4 games. Darnell Washington's at 50%. Dylan Bell is probably the next guy to mention, 55% of the routes last week. I think I'd rather play Jacksaint, but we're really digging deep here between Dylan Bell and Jacksaint. It's tough to evaluate Georgia. Oregon, Cal, 59 total, 17-point spread in favor of the Ducks. Not fast, but hyper efficient. 82nd in pace, 46% pass rate. Bo Nix. It's not pick six Bo Nix. It's Heisman Bo Nix season. He's averaging 258 pass yards per game on 30.5 attempts. 382 rushing yards. Bo Nix has awesome efficiency. Call me crazy, but Bo Nix, I haven't looked at projections recently. He might project better than CJ Stroud just because of the rushing ability. Now, don't get it twisted. CJ Stroud is better, but for a 9K quarterback, I got to have some rushing output, and Nix has it. He also has a good team total at 38, and he's good as a passer. How much money would you have bet that I would ever say I prefer Bo Nix to CJ Stroud in DFS? I'm thinking about it right now. I never thought I'd see the day, but honestly, I'm at least asking the question. Do I prefer Bo Nix to CJ Stroud? It's ridiculous to say. Anyway, let's move on. In the backfield, they'd been using a 3-way timeshare all year, and they still used, a 4-way timeshare all year, 5 when Cardwell was healthy, but he's not healthy now. They sort of reduced it to 2. Jordan James and Sean Dollar saw their workload snapped. And Bucky Irving, 19 carries for him. 3 targets. It's 22 touches for Bucky Irving. He's been so efficient. At some point, they just had to make this commitment. No Whittington playing a change of pace role. Irving's still too cheap if he's going to see 22 touches. I think he's fine against Cal, who's, they're not good on defense, but they're not bad either. I think he's playable. The receiving room, Troy Franklin's been awesome. The volume's just not great for him. 76.5 receiving yards per game on 5.9 targets. He hasn't seen more than 7 targets in any of the last 4 games, so I'd rather play somebody more involved. Chase Cota is the wide receiver 2, 4.7 targets per game, 44.7 yards per game. Chris Hudson's quickly emerging as the 3. The passing volume is spread pretty evenly, so it's hard to play any of them with confidence, but it's always tough because you want pieces of Oregon's offense. I think I'm going to lean on Hudson and Franklin, the most, Cota in between, but honestly, I'm probably going to play Bucky Irving more than any of them. You can also play Nix naked. That's valuable too. On Cal, maybe Oregon drags them into a potential shootout here, but Cal's slow. Jack Plummer's been okay. He averages 250 yards per game through the air, but negative 64 rushing yards. He's going to need to overcome that with a ceiling passing game. I just don't see it. They use Jaden Ott and DeCarlos Brooks in a timeshare again. Like, sometimes they use Ott as the bell cow, sometimes they don't. So he's risky, especially as an underdog here. I would look elsewhere. Like I said, I prefer Irving 1-for-1 to Ott. In the receiving room, this is where you can find some cheap value, especially in a potential shootout with Cal trailing. Jeremiah Hunter missed their last game. I don't know if he comes back. If he does, he's a starting 3 guy. If he doesn't, it's going to be J. Michael Sturdivant as the 1, Marvin Anderson as the 2. You can pencil in Anderson as the 3 if Hunter returns, but ultimately I think Sturdivant is the best play at 5,200. He has 11 and 13 targets in back-to-back games. If Hunter returns, he's playable, and then Marvin Anderson's your cheap option. He has 12 targets over the last 2 games in that increased role. And then let's say Jeremiah Hunter misses. The new wide receiver 3 would be Mason Starling, 5 targets apiece in the last 2 games. Not efficient, but he's very cheap at 3,100. Wake Forest, Louisville, good game here. 64 total, 3.5 point spread in favor of Wake. Wake is 15th in pace, 47.5% pass rate. they will drastically tailor their game plan to the weaknesses of their opponents. We've seen them super run heavy. We've seen them super pass heavy. Sam Hartman's awesome. 71 rush yards per game, 293 passing yards per game on just 32 attempts. That's really efficient. You just hope you get the pass heavy Wake Forest if you're playing him at that price. If they go run heavy Wake Forest, he's going to be tough to play and tough to pay off that salary. But it's basically a two-way committee at running back, Justice Ellison, Christian Turner. We've recently seen Quentin Cooley play a little bit and just enough to make Ellison and Turner headaches. Like playing any of them at this point's hard, but I think Turner and Ellison are the guys you look to in tournaments specifically. If you were to do this, I don't think I will. In the receiving game, A.T. Perry still the wide receiver 1. He only saw 3 targets last week, 7.6 targets per game, 75 yards. The going's getting tough for Perry at 7K. I certainly prefer some of the other options in that price range, but this has been a theme with Wake all year. They're rotating routes more than they ever have, which is super concerning. Perry came in last week with a 72% route share. Last year, we were seeing him at 80, 90% at times. It's tough to get to. Donovan Green, second most involved, 65% route share. Jamal Banks, third at 63%. Then we had Keyshawn Williams, 51%. Taylor Morin, 49%. Plus tight end Blake Whiteheart, 61%. You can see how routes become volatile for all these guys. Honestly, it's one A.T. Perry still, barely, and then Donovan Green, 2 at 5,300. Green at 11 targets last week. Now, he had 2 the week before, so that shows the volatility. But Green, I think, is the overall best price-adjusted option. Louisville, 63rd in pace, 44% pass rate. Malik Cunningham, a bit up and down this year. He just doesn't have the best supporting cast, but he has 503 rushing yards already, 179 passing yards per game. He's been hurt at times too. He still has that elite ceiling, we know. So I'm going to play some Cunningham without a doubt based on that rushing upside. They also haven't had Tyon Evans at running back. That's let them kind of rotate between Jawar Jordan and Trevion Cooley. It's going to be a timeshare regardless, but I'd have more interest in like a Cooley if Tyon Evans misses again. We'll have to monitor. In the receiving game, Tyler Hudson's the one. 7.7 targets per game, 69 yards. They didn't have Amari Huggins-Bruce last week. He's going to come back. He's emerged into a full-time player. Finally, route shares have been above 75% for him, so he's usable. And then Marshawn Ford's always your cheap play if you need one. He's at 4,200, very consistent in terms of routes, but with Amari Huggins-Bruce coming back, that would hurt him. And then behind him, Braden Smith's been the 3. He bumped up to the 2 without Amari Huggins-Bruce last week. I think he drops back down to around 70% of the routes if AHB returns. Stackable there. Illinois, Nebraska, 50 total, 7.5 point spread in favor of Illinois, who's the easiest team to evaluate in the country. Not exactly, but it's basically, do you play Chase Brown or do you not play Chase Brown? Here are his touches. This is ridiculous. 22, 4 weeks ago. 26, 3 weeks ago. 37, 2 weeks ago. And last week, 44 touches for Chase Brown. He's averaging 150 receiving yards per game. As a receiver, he's at 15.3. This is insane. Nebraska is allowing 4.8 yards per rush attempt. Chase Brown's 7,500. This guy should be 10K. Chase Brown is one of the first guys you're looking at. He is awesome, and his role is incredible. If you are targeting a receiver, Isaiah Williams, he's more involved than Pat Bryant, 59 targets to 37 on the year, but Bryant's more efficient. He has outgained Isaiah Williams, 367 to 354. The price is almost the same on these guys. I think I'm avoiding both, but if you needed to play one, it's Pat Bryant for me. And then the wide receiver 3 is Brian Hightower for those of you that just want to know. Nebraska, 22nd in pace, 49% pass rate. Casey Thompson, 264 passing yards per game. He is negative 49 rushing yards, which is ridiculous. Illinois plays one of the best defenses in the country, 4.9 yards per pass attempt. Holy smokes, Casey Thompson's got his work cut out for him. I think I'd rather just look elsewhere than play him, but my goodness, tough matchup. In the backfield, we've already seen A.J. Allen gone. Gabe Irvin's not expected to play. That means Anthony Grant should be the lead back again. They're using Jaquez Yant as a change of pace, but Grant dominated snaps last game, I should say. 96.6 rushing yards per game for Grant, 7.9 receiving yards per game on 22.3 touches. I think you can use him as a GPP option, but he's still a big underdog against maybe the best run defense in the Big Ten, especially in the West. Receiving game, Trey Palmer has a voluminous role, so he's viable regardless of matchup. 111.6, excuse me. So 111.6 receiving yards per game on 9.1 targets. He's averaging 9.8 targets per game over the last 4. It's a 31% target share. Trey Palmer, solid, just tough matchup. Marcus Washington's the 2. Travis Vokalek, their tight end, is third most involved. Oliver Martin has stepped up a lot recently for Nebraska. So if you're just looking for a raw punt at 3,800, he's somebody that's at least worth mentioning. He popped up last week for pretty good route share, 59%, still behind, Vokalek and Marcus Washington and Palmer. But yeah, it is what it is. Cincinnati takes on UCF. Really interesting matchup here. This actually closed out the slate. Last game here, 56 total, 2-point spread in favor of UCF. Cincinnati is 66th in pace, 51% pass rate. They're relying a lot on Ben Bryant, who has no mobility, negative 50 rushing yards, and 254 yards per game as a passer on just 31.5 attempts. He's stackable in tournaments, but UCF's played good defense. There's just better options at his price tag, pure tournament play. With Corey Kiner back in the fold, it's a two-way committee at running back between Charles McClelland and Corey Kiner. Kiner, a little bit more of a GPP play. McClelland, he's averaging 90.1 rushing yards per game, also active as a receiver. He leads the running backfield in targets. I'd be trying to play him if anybody, but it's a little dicier now that Kiner's back. Tyler Scott missed last week's game. He was in a boot. I don't know if we see him. He's the leading receiver when healthy, 84 yards per game for him. Trey Tucker, the presumed wide receiver 2, flopped miserably. 4 targets. He did not receive a full route share, which was a big concern moving forward. 67% of the routes. I don't know if he's hurt or what it is. That's not good. And then, honestly, we saw more routes for Jaden Thompson. He was at 75%. Nick Mardner came in at 61%. I mean, they both played more than Scott, and they both out-targeted him. Nick Mardner, 8 targets. Jaden Thompson, 5. Somewhat interested in Nick Mardner and Jaden Thompson, but honestly, better yet than those guys, it's probably just playing tight end Josh Wiley, who's been really involved this year, 6 targets. He's 4K flat. These would be the GPP options for this team, but this game is sneaky shootout potential. UCF on the other side is 40th in pace, 42.8% pass rate. That's because John Reese Plumlee, he's electric on the ground, 506 rushing yards this year. He's averaging 261 as a passer on 29 attempts. And we talked about this in the betting show on Betting You. John Reese Plumlee was actually efficient in their last game. He was pretty good. The only thing is he had so many turnovers, which is an issue. I mean, you can't erase turnovers in their game-flipping plays, but John Reese Plumlee's actually been pretty good as a passer, and the stats indicate it. He'll be facing a tougher matchup here for sure, but all this to say, 8,700 for a guy this mobile. Like, in a vacuum, this is crazy to say again, but I probably prefer – I don't want to say it. I was going to say I prefer him to Stroud, but that's kind of insane. He's right up there with Stroud, I'll say that. The backfield, Bowser sort of lost that bell cow workload. They're using more RJ Harvey, and he's been awesome. It's well-deserved. RJ Harvey's averaging more yards per game on the ground than Bowser, and he only has 37 carries. Bowser has 100 carries in the year. RJ Harvey deserves more work. Ultimately, he probably is just more of an annoyance at this point, taking away the viability of either of these guys, but Reese Plumlee is also very involved in the ground. I'd rather play him overall than either of the rushers. In the receiving room, Ryan O'Keefe has been the wide receiver 1 of late. That's with Javon Baker nursing an injury. He only played a bit last week before his injury allegedly tightened up and he had to come off the field. So Baker, you're not really going to know. He's dicey because of the injury and he's at risk for aggravation. Without him, Kobe Hudson stepped up a lot. He led the team in targets last week. He's got priced up accordingly too. So it's not like you're getting any sort of value with Kobe Hudson either. They're going to rotate tight ends. I don't have a lot of interest in Alec Holler. I don't have a lot of interest in the ancillary receivers here. So I think that'll do it. If you guys have questions, of course, leave a comment. Would love to hear them. My name is Matt Gajewski. I'll make sure to get back to you in the comment section and hit the thumbs up button. Subscribe to the channel on the way out. If you want to reach out on Twitter, I'm at Matt_Gajewski. Willing to answer any questions there. And good luck, everyone. We'll see you guys again next time, I suppose. Again, let me know if you have questions, but until next time, we'll see you later.